I'm a little bit out of my depth here, but I thought because it's so timely, I would talk about fashion in general and innovation in fashion, and not so much from the standpoint of having a brilliant designer, but what are the principles that the fashion industry is using both to identify, if you will, new platform opportunities or new genres of fashion styles, number one, and also how might they be using innovation to promote these products. And so, as Mary said, the first thing I want to talk about, again, because it's so timely, is something called TennisCore. It's become, if you will, the hot new thing. It's all over social media now, and it was timely, obviously, because we just finished the U.S. Open, and it's also been promoted at Fashion Week, which is going on in New York City. So what is TennisCore? Let me set it up this way. There's a book that came out about 5 years ago. It's called Hitmakers. It's by Derek Thompson, who's a senior editor at Atlantic, and he did an in-depth study of, what makes something a hit. Entertainment, music and movies and books, et cetera, et cetera. And I can save the listeners the time of not having to read the book. I think you can, for me at least, you could capture the essence of that book in 2 words. What would make a hit? And that essence is familiar surprise. I'll say it again, familiar surprise. And the notion is that if you want to create a hit, you want something that's potentially familiar to people, right? So that there's a certain acceptance from the get-go, but also you need that energy and excitement and difference of something surprising, right? And so obviously the best example of this would be the sequels in the movie industry, right? We know these characters, or online, or obviously TV series, et cetera. We know these characters and often the plots, but there's surprising things going on, right? So what does that have to do with TennisCore and tennis fashion? Well, TennisCore really is a look to the past, fashion of, some have called this nouveau prep, right? The notion that these tennis styles could be very, if you will, preppy, right? Now, there are 2 elements to the surprise. So they have that classic look, if you think of the 1970s Wimbledon players all in their nice whites, right? And so they've somewhat got that classic look, but now they have obviously new colors, new materials. And so, yes, it rings the chord of familiarity with the past, yes, but it's also been updated to look sort of chic. Now, that's the first half of this, the familiar surprise. Now, the other important principle behind the success of TennisCore, if you want to think of it as a portmanteau, right? A portmanteau is a mashing together of 2 different words, not unlike tennis and core, right? Core tennis, right? Or score, if you prefer to think of it that way. But what they've done in these new fashions for tennis is they've got athleisure, right? So we've all heard that term, right? Athleisure, it's a mashup of athletic and leisure. And so the notion is that these fashions, and there were some headlines in the press this week about seeing the tennis skirts on the street or whatever, right? The notion that now people are able to wear these because they're so fashionably when they go out in a leisure situation. So the bigger thought here is if we can leverage something that's familiar and surprising, right? But also that ties into a trend, right? It definitely ties into a lifestyle trend of convenience and comfort and all the rest. And Oprah's a big fan of this, et cetera. Then we really may have something, all right? So let me give you an example of how this has been leveraged with a specific brand, right? So I had never heard of this brand, but this is another example of nouveau prep. It's called Rowing Blazers, right? And so it's these very preppy looking things created by this guy, Jack Carlson. And so he said, how can I leverage this TennisCore trend, if you will? So if you think, I'll do a little quiz here for the listener, who had sort of the most preppy outfit or was the cleanest cut, if you will, tennis player, let's say in the 70s, right? We would not say Mattimore, right? He would be the last choice, right? So who might that be? And once I say it, I think you'll agree, but you may not think of it because to me it wasn't obvious. I like to think it was Arthur Ashe. I mean, how, sort of clean cut and proper and wonderful he always looked, right? On the court and in person. And I think that was in some ways a brilliant strategy because some of his more controversial ideas for ethnic equality, I think were more readily be accepted because he had this sort of very clean cut look and he was a terrific person, as we know, and there's a new documentary on him and his life. So this guy that created the Rowing Blazer said, well, maybe I'll create a line of clothes based on the sort of Arthur Ashe look. And he's done that. And what's really smart, and this gets back to another innovation principle here, is he's tied into a trend. Now, what is that trend? That trend is what? Social giving, right? That's an important trend. We see that as a motivator for millennials. So if you go on to the Arthur Ashe Collection site, now these clothes are expensive. You can get a warm-up jacket for $195 or a pair of sweats for $175 or a cap for $60. It's not cheap, but of course what they're doing is then they're donating monies to the Arthur Ashe Foundation, right? And also Social Change Fund United, percentage of their sales goes to that. So again, the principle here is that we want to tie into familiar surprise, but also at the same time tie into a trend, whether it's athleisure or social good or social giving. All right, so let me just turn to Fashion Week now, because this is going on in New York City. And if you read the articles about this, a lot of the headlines talk about fashion tech. And so the notion now is that tech is being introduced into fashion. For Vogue's 130th year anniversary celebration at Fashion Week this week, they got together with Snap and they created augmented reality lenses so that people could have this immersive experience in the runway, right? And this is not, unique to them. Polo has done similar things. Alo Yoga, which is luxury wear, right? They've done the thing. This is an old idea, but they've made it work. This notion of augmented reality mirrors, so you can try stuff on virtually, et cetera, et cetera. My bias is that fashion tech is really just at the first stage here. Now, they're using tech here to promote the ideas, to promote their lines, to make it sexy, right? And make it fun and interesting. But as we know, Internet of Things will start combining with fashion, so that we'll have fashion that makes us potentially healthier, right? Protects us in certain ways, but certainly also they're pioneering efforts now to create fashion that's organic, that sort of you grow fashion, et cetera. So we're just at the beginning of the technology revolution in terms of fashion. So I want to just share one last thing now and go back to this notion of TennisCore, because what they've done is tied into a different trend, a different societal trend. This is the company Rothy's, right? And this is such a clever idea. I just love it. So what they did last year at the U.S. Open tennis tournament, they collected 72,000 Evian water bottles at the U.S. Open, 72,000. Then they took all 72,000 of those, cut them up, and they have a 3D knitting process, right, that allows them to create these threads out of the plastics. And from those, they created sneakers, they created a racket bag, they created a sling, et cetera, et cetera. And this year, they were selling those products at the U.S. Open, right? I just love this mashing up of familiar surprise, but also, frankly, taking stuff and tying into a current trend, right? So for those listeners, I would encourage you, this could be done in anything, right? I mean, even like in food products. I mean, when we did trying to invent a new Chips Ahoy cookie, we tied into something that also was familiar besides the Chips Ahoy cookie, which was brownies, mashed those two up, right? And we got brownie Chips Ahoy, which has been a big success for them. So I would encourage the curious and quirky listener to look at the societal trends and say, how can we dovetail and mash up with those? So obviously tech is one, fashion tech was one. Sustainability, we just heard about that with Rothy's. Health, right? Is there something that can make, in this case, clothes healthier or whatever, but in any area? Education is certainly one, or self-actualization, right? And finally, the last one, which is reminiscent of the Arthur Ashe line, is the whole notion of social good. So my challenge to the curious and quirky listener, can you mash up some of these trends with something that's familiar and surprising for your next hit?